Hello and welcome to Fantastic Fights, the podcast about a middle-aged man playing adventure game books out loud on the internet. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this is another bonus episode made possible by my patrons over at patreon.com. This episode is something of an emergency episode, a way to get something out quick. I've been very ill for the last week with one of the various unpleasant winter diseases that have been doing the rounds. I'm still not 100% better if I'm honest, but hey-ho. This means that when I should have been preparing a bonus episode of this podcast and working on my new game book, I was instead lying in bed watching old horror movies and trying to sleep. I'm still not right, but I'm better enough that I felt like I should get something recorded. So it's going to be a shorter episode than usual, but I just wanted to get something released before I have to start work on the next fighting fantasy book and keep my unbroken record of bonus episodes going. And this is where choose your own adventure books come into their own. There's not a lot of analysis you can usually do on one of these, they're all designed in fundamentally the same way, but we can take a look at a couple and see how well they deliver on their premise, and hopefully that will be a nice time. This is also an opportunity to focus on books in the series that have themes which are very different from your classic fighting fantasy book. I think one of the strengths of Choose Your Own Adventure is the wider range of inspirations they draw from. The possibilities are almost endless, and that's quite the refreshing change after 50 plus variations on sword-wielding adventurers stabbing monsters for fame and fortune. Not that there's anything wrong with that, I really like that, but it's nice to see what the rest of the world has to offer. First up, we're going to look at Who Killed Harlowe Thrombey, Book 9 in the Choose Your Own Adventure series. It was written by series creator Edward Packard and illustrated by Paul Granger. This is something of a murder mystery, and I'm a big fan of murder mysteries, so I'll be interested to see how that interacts with branching narratives. A really good murder mystery is a kind of puzzle box, a series of complex moving parts that only work if they're all in exactly the right place. I'm not sure that's a good fit with an idiot like me blundering through the middle of it, but I'm sure it'll all turn out okay in the end. Before we get started, a quick note about my upcoming game book. What with losing an entire week to the festive pestilence, it's looking likely that the delivery date will slip into early 2025, which is disappointing, especially as I'm pretty close to the end of writing the words bit of the process. I will continue working on it through December, but obviously as Christmas approaches, time will get more difficult to find. I'd say I'm 80% done, but once I complete the words, there's still the small matter of editing the text and playtesting it, and I don't see a way that I'll get through all of that before January. I'll do my very best, but it's not looking great. I'm sorry about that, but I will try and get it sorted as soon as possible. Anyway, let's play Who Killed Harlowe Thrombey. It's been just a year since the robber climbed into your Aunt Miranda's bedroom window at 2 o'clock in the morning. "Get out!" she screamed at him, and that's just what he did, taking her pearl necklace with him. The next day, you found a beer bottle in the bushes outside Aunt Miranda's house. Since she isn't the sort to toss beer bottles out of the window, you handed it over to the police. The robber's fingerprints were on the bottle, the police quickly identified him, and now he's safely behind bars. Since then, you've gotten quite a reputation as a detective. You've equipped yourself with a magnifying glass, fingerprint kit, and a cassette recorder, and you're ready for business. Some of your friends have decided to become detectives too. That's okay. They're just a bunch of amateurs, except maybe for that frizzy-haired girl down the street, Jenny Mudge. She's definitely smart. In fact, sometimes you think she might be smarter than you are. Now it looks like you've got your first big case. Harlowe Thrombey, president of Thrombey Plastics, has just called and asked you to come to his house at 5 o'clock this afternoon. "I hear you have sharp eyes," he said, "and that's what I need right now. I think my life is in danger." So, typical plutocrat. As soon as a problem arises, his first thought is, what about child labour? There is a picture of our protagonist answering the phone, and it's very much an early 80s children's illustration. The kid's got a vigorous side parting, I would say. And lovely old-style rotary telephone, of course. What appears to be pressed slacks. It's a terrible thing to make a child wear, but they were more barbaric times. It's a simple line drawing. Doesn't look as though the artist spent a vast amount of time on it, I'll be honest. Yeah, it's quite impressive that the child looks as much like an accountant on his day off as he does. That is a strong look for the under-15s. You asked Thrombey what he was afraid of, but he didn't want to talk on the phone, so you said you'd think about it and call him back. It was exciting to get a call from Harlowe Thrombey, but maybe you should find out more about him before taking the case. So, do you want to phone him and accept his invitation, or tell him that you can't come this afternoon, but you'll call him back in a day or so? Well, I'm a firm believer in not being too keen. Don't want to let the great and good think they've got the upper hand, so we will delay for a day and mull it over. Obviously, as a child, I've got many demands on my time. The next morning you're up early, thinking about Harlowe Thrombey, wondering whether his life really is in danger. Your thoughts are interrupted by the ringing telephone. A shaking voice is on the wire. "This is John McGee, Harlowe Thrombey's lawyer. Have you heard the news?" "What news?" "Mr. Thrombey told me that if anything happened, I was to call you. I'm afraid something has happened. Harlowe Thrombey has been murdered. He was poisoned last night. Someone broke into the greenhouse about 6 o'clock and took a bottle of arsenic. Later, the murderer poured the arsenic into Thrombey's brandy bottle." "How awful," you reply. "He told me his life was in danger, but I hardly believed him." "None of us did," McGee says. "The police seem to think his wife Jane did it, but I would bet it was one of the dinner guests." "Who were they?" you ask. "His nephew, Chartwell, his niece, Angela, and her boyfriend, Dr. Robert Lipscomb." "Let me ask you another question," you continue. "Do the police know when the murderer poured the arsenic into Thrombey's brandy bottle?" "Not exactly," McGee says, "but they know it must have been between 8 o'clock when he gave his guests a drink and 9 o'clock when he went back to pour another for himself." "And how do they know the greenhouse was broken into about 6 o'clock?" "That was quite a stroke of luck," McGee says. "A young girl was visiting Helga, the Thrombey's cook. She noticed the greenhouse was locked at 4 o'clock when she came to visit, and then when she left at 6 o'clock, it had been broken open." "She must have sharp eyes," you say. "You may know her," McGee says. "Jenny Mudge is her name." Mudge, my old nemesis." You thank McGee for calling and hang up the phone. Shocked by the news, you resolve to do your best to solve the Harlowe Thrombey murder case. From what you know of Jenny Mudge, you can be sure she has the same idea. Inspector Prufrock will be in charge of the case, no doubt. In your opinion, he is a bumbling idiot. Even with the whole police force working for him, he can't usually solve the simplest of cases. Still, it would be a good idea to talk to him and find out whether he has stumbled across anything important. On the other hand, perhaps you should first inspect the scene of the crime. Well, if he's an idiot, he's not going to tell me anything that I don't already know, so I will go straight to the Thrombey house in the hope that I can find whatever useful clues there are before Jenny Mudge does. It's doing a nice job, early doors, of giving us a set of circumstances and a few clues, and also giving us a little bit of pressure that there's this clever girl, Jenny Mudge, who may well get to the answer before us if we make the wrong decisions. So that's a fun way of creating stakes that are meaningful for younger readers, but not threatening, like whoever murders Thrombey might well be after you. When you arrive at the Thrombey house, you find no one home except Helga, the maid. A slight, shy woman with soft brown eyes. She tells you she spent from 5 o'clock until 6 o'clock with Jenny Mudge cooking in the kitchen, and that she left after dinner at 8 to visit her brother in the hospital, staying until 9. "Do you have any idea who did it?" you ask. "I've been trying to think," she replies. I would guess it was Dr. Robert Lipscomb. There's something I don't like about that man. But I don't see how he could have done it, because Chartwell says that Robert stayed with him in the game room all evening. I know Chartwell wouldn't lie to protect Robert. I once overheard him tell Mr. Thrombey that he didn't trust Robert. You thank Helga for her information and go to the hospital, where you find she did indeed visit Jenkins from 8 to 9 the night of the murder. By this time you're curious to know whether Jenny Mudge discovered anything. I hope Jenny Mudge turns out to have been the murderer. It would be a good twist. It would be a really good twist. This is doing a bang-up job of introducing the timeline, introducing the suspects. I'm remarkably invested already in how this is going to turn out. You find Jenny on the front porch of her house, sitting on a rocker, reading a magazine. Taking a seat in an old wicker chair, you tip back and put your feet up on the porch railing. Well, do you have any theory about the case? You ask. How's this for a theory? Jenny says. Harlowe Thrombey committed suicide. But why? Why would he do it in a way that makes it look like murder? You ask. Maybe he was sick and tired of living. I mean, if he's over 35, the chances are pretty good that he was. And he did it in that way because he wanted to make Jane suffer and let his niece Angela inherit all his money. Why do you think he would be such a rat? You ask. Well, Helga says he always thought someone was out to get him, mainly his wife. So maybe he pretended he was murdered to prove that he was right. Jenny is smiling broadly by the time she finishes, and you begin to wonder whether she's just pulling your leg. Still, her theory just might be right. I don't buy it. He's a plutocrat. He's got enemies up the wazoo, including me, ideologically, if not pragmatically. I mean, I'm pretty sure I didn't do it. It's 1981, and Edward Packard has never met me, to my knowledge. Also, I was 2 years old in 1981 when this was written, so yeah, I think it's very unlikely that I will turn out to be the murderer, but that would be the most amazing twist. I don't buy Jenny's theory, so I'm not going to investigate it. I'm going to try a different approach. There's a picture on the next section of me looking thoughtful, and also about 35. If Harlowe Thrombey wanted to commit suicide, why would he have asked for your help? It seems certain that he was murdered, but you need more evidence. Perhaps you should return to the Thrombey house. On the other hand, maybe Jenny has some other ideas. So let's go back to the Thrombey house. I think Jenny's just going to try and send me up the garden path, quite honestly. When you arrive at the house a half hour later, you see a large black car in the driveway. A short man dressed in a grey pinstriped suit is walking towards it. With him is Jane Thrombey. You go out to talk to Jane, but the man in the pinstriped suit steps in front of her. I'm Mr. Prem, he says, Mrs. Thrombey's lawyer. Can you tell me, Mr. Prem, you ask, who will inherit all of Harlowe Thrombey's money? Prem smiles. Yes, but it will not help you solve this case, I'm afraid. Thrombey's will provides that his fortune will be divided equally among his wife, Jane, his niece Angela, and his nephew Chartwell. Of course, under the law, a murderer is not allowed to inherit anything from the person he or she murders. If caught, you say. If caught. Prem turns his back. I think we'd better return to my office, he says to Jane. You go on into the Thrombey house, almost bumping into Chartwell as you step inside the front door. This looks like a good time to question him. I can talk only a few minutes, Chartwell says. I only have a few questions, you reply. First, how long was it before he screamed that Harlowe Thrombey left you and Robert in the game room? It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes, Chartwell replies. Who knew the arsenic was kept in the greenhouse? Everyone but Dr. Robert Lipscomb, but I'll tell you I'm very suspicious of that fellow. Where were you between the time you arrived the afternoon of the murder and the time we first met? Why, I met you as soon as I arrived at the house. But you should know that when I pulled up the drive, I saw Robert running to the front door, coming from the direction of the greenhouse. I think he was the one who broke in and took the arsenic." Chartwell glances at his watch, turns and heads out of the door. At the same time... Dun dun dun... Prufrock strides towards you from the direction of the library. "I've solved the murder!" he shouts, and there is a picture of the ecstatic Prufrock, a middle-aged man with what looks to be a sad comb-over and a vibrant moustache. His arms flung wide in adulation, coming into the room. This is one of the better pictures I've seen so far. It's got a lot of energy to it, which I always appreciate. And the artist has bothered to put in the background of the room as well. Interestingly, there seems to be someone doing something outside. There's a window open, and through the window I can see a figure creeping about. I don't know who the figure is. Could that prove important later? It'd be interesting if it did. Anyway, Prufrock thinks he solved the murder. Through the window you see Chartwell getting into his car. Yep, fair enough. Maybe I should have read the paragraph before describing the picture. And you respond to Prufrock's outburst. "How interesting," you say. "Who is it?" "You may have heard that the murderer poured arsenic into Thrombey's brandy bottle late in the evening. We found that Chartwell broke into the greenhouse using a pair of garden shears to pry the door open. We found the shears in his car. The blade points match the marks made when the murderer pried the padlock off the greenhouse door." "I wouldn't be so sure of yourself, Prufrock," you say. The two of you look out of the window as Chartwell's car roars down the drive. "Whose car is that?" Prufrock demands. "I'm afraid it belongs to the man you want to arrest," you reply. Prufrock rushes outdoors. You follow and watch him as he races to his car and jumps behind the wheel, fumbling for his keys. "Where are the keys? Where are the keys to this car?" A policeman rushes from the house holding a set of keys in the air. "You never told me to leave them in the car, sir," he calls as he runs towards the car. A moment later they roar down the drive, lights flashing and sirens screaming. So, Inspector Prufrock, presumably off on completely the wrong track, and indeed the text broadly agrees. You shake your head in disbelief. It's at least as likely that the person who used the shears would toss them into Chartwell's car as that Chartwell himself would leave them there. Prufrock reminds you of a dog chasing a rabbit that's just run the other way. You return home, for you have some work to do there before lunch. By the time you get back to the Thrombey house, no one seems to be at home. After ringing the bell several times, you try the door. It's unlocked and you step inside and walk down the hall to the library. Suddenly you feel the hard pressure of a gun in your back. "Don't move! Don't look around!" A heavy hand on your shoulder shoves you into a chair. You dare not resist as your attacker wraps a towel tightly around your head and over your eyes and then ties you to a chair. You hear papers rustling. Someone must be searching through Harlowe Thrombey's desk. You could probably get a hand free and rip off the blindfold, but that might be dangerous. So there is a picture of us tied to a chair with a towel on our head. Again, pretty decent actually. I think there's a real mix of quality to these images. I mean, they are still pretty basic, I would have to say, certainly compared with something like Fighting Fantasy, where you're often treated to some of the finest fantasy illustrators working in the business. Which isn't to diss Paul Granger. This is very much a standard children's illustration. He's doing exactly what you would expect a man to do in this situation, but yeah, it really does remind me just how good the art in Fighting Fantasy generally is. Anyway, I'm going to rip off my blindfold. Reaching for your blindfold, you feel a smashing pain in your head. You are slowly waking up. Your head is pounding. A bandage covers half your scalp and one ear. You're lying somewhere. It must be a hospital bed. A doctor is standing next to you. "We had to stitch you up a little," he says. "It's not serious. You can walk out of here in the morning." He starts to leave and then turns back. "Oh, they found this note next to you." He hands you an envelope from which you remove a small sheet of yellow ruled paper. It reads, "Drop this case, or next time you'll end in the cemetery. In this business you have to take chances. Still, it might be healthier to solve this case in a hurry." Early the next morning you walk out of the hospital into the bright sunshine, thinking about Angela. Was she the one who broke into the greenhouse, took the arsenic and poisoned the brandy? I will go and investigate Angela, because it's either that or talk to Jenny Mudge again, and I'll be damned if I'm going to talk to her. She's mean and makes fun of me. You are curious about Angela's visit to Dr. Marlowe, her dentist, the afternoon of the murder, and you decide to pay a visit to his office. "I'm checking something for the Thrombey family," you tell the nurse. "Was Harlowe Thrombey's niece Angela here 2 days ago from 5 to 6? "Why, yes, that's right," the nurse replies. "Did she leave something here?" "No, I'm just checking. What was she here for? What treatment?" "She was just getting her teeth cleaned," the nurse replies. "She called to make the appointment the day before, and when I said we were booked up, she insisted on coming at 5 o'clock anyway." Can you imagine that? She's just lucky Dr. Marlowe was able to take her. It feels as though the evidence is increasingly pointing towards Robert Lipscomb and Angela. It feels as though she's deliberately trying to get herself an alibi. What should you do next? So we now come to a something I've not seen before in a Choose Your Own Adventure book, one with no less than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 choices. So we've got options about having found fingerprints. We can go and talk to Robert, Chartwell, Angela, Jane, Jenny, Prufrock, and Gilliam Prem. You can go and sit in a quiet place and think about what you already know. You can give up on the case, or if you're absolutely sure you have the case wrapped up, you can turn to more or less the end. So I think it was Robert. I'm pretty certain of it, so I'll go and have a quick chat with him. You telephone Robert Lipscomb and he agrees to meet you at the Thrombey house in half an hour. You get to Prufrock on the phone and ask him to come too. "I can't," he replies. "I'm questioning the other suspects right now." "Bring them along," you say, "and I promise to wrap this case up today." There is a long pause before Prufrock answers. "Okay, but if you don't deliver on that promise, I'll arrest you for interfering with the work of a police officer." A half hour later, the library is filled with people. Jane, Chartwell, and Angela are seated along one wall, while Robert Lipscomb sits in a high-backed armchair. You stand in a corner where you can watch everyone at once. Prufrock and another policeman stay near the door. "All right, Sherlock Holmes," Prufrock says, blowing a puff of pipe smoke in your direction. "Tell us how Harlowe Thrombey was murdered." "Robert can tell us best," you reply. "Of course I can," Robert says, "because I was the one who heard Harlowe Thrombey's last words. Jane poured my last drink." And there is a double-page spread of the various suspects sitting around looking mostly guilty, I have to say. Inspector Prufrock looking plump and oddly pleased with himself. The library's quite nicely realised. There is, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, a tuba on one of the bookshelves, but yeah, it's a decent bit of work. You pull your tape cassette out of your pocket and shove it in front of Robert's face. "I had a tape recorder planted in the music room all evening," you say. "The piano never stopped. Since Jane was the only one playing, I know you lied about Thrombey's last words." "But I couldn't have poured his last drink. I was in the game room," Robert says. "True enough," you say, "and so was Chartwell. Angela was the only one who could have put the poison in the brandy bottle." "Then I'm innocent!" Robert cries. "No, you're not!" screams Angela, her face red with anger. "You got that arsenic from the greenhouse from me." Suddenly Robert is on his feet making a break for the door. In a flash, Prufrock pins him against the bookcase. Angela slumps in her chair, burying her head in her arms. "It's such a shame," Jane Thrombey says. "Harlowe was going to give the two of you a trip to Hawaii for a wedding present." Prufrock shuffles towards you. takes the cassette from out of your hand and stares at it dumbly like a dog staring at its reflection in the water. "How did you think of putting a tape recorder in the music room?" he says. "To tell the truth, I didn't," you reply, taking the cassette back from him. "This is just an old Beatles recording." The end. So that's sort of an ending. There are others. That is not perhaps the most satisfying ending, but it is an ending. Yeah, I think this has actually done a decent job of giving you the experience of investigating a murder and meeting all the suspects and finding various clues. Clearly, more important clues I could have found along the way, but that's the nature of interactive fiction, I guess. So, yeah, I think that's a fairly solid effort to capture a very particular experience. Now, we're going to compare and contrast that with The Race Forever, which is by R.A. Montgomery, who wrote a lot of choose-your-own-adventure books, over 50, I gather, in his life, and he was one of the people involved in publishing the choose-your-own-adventure books. And one of his concerns as a writer was to represent a broader range of experiences than perhaps most American 10, 11-year-olds might be familiar with. He really was someone who wanted to show his readers the world, and I think this is an interesting example of that, because the premise is that you are an experienced race car driver competing in the first African dual road race rally. So that's an exciting premise for a story, and again, a very different premise to anything that we've seen in the Fighting Fantasy series. Actually, I think a race is a pretty good premise for a game book, because obviously often geography tends to be more important than character in a lot of game books, and a continental race is an ideal way to feature geography, do that kind of road movie thing that game books are so often drawing from. Now, I haven't checked to see whether this African set book is massively racist, which is a potential pitfall. But having looked at Montgomery's views on writing and the world, I'd be a little bit surprised if it was deliberately racist. It may be accidentally racist, probably will be accidentally racist. It is, after all, a middle-class white guy writing about Africa. But I don't think, hopefully, we're going to get any colonialist tropes rearing their ugly head. But anyway, we will find out as I play The Race Forever. Oh, with illustrations by Ralph Reese. So on the facing page we get a decent map of northeastern Africa, I guess correct, circa 1981, complete with the equator, which is nice. Yeah, it's a decent quality map, and it makes this already feel as though it's a more grounded and realistic story than perhaps many in this space. You've been almost too nervous to look out of the plane window at the African countryside below. The smiling stewardess leaning over to check your seatbelt jolts you back to reality. We're approaching the airport in Nairobi now. So, starting off in Kenya. You look out of the window. Now you can see the large modern city below. The gently rolling terrain is unlike the Arizona ranch country where you grew up. You remember the cable that brought you here. There's a blast from the past. Cables. Congratulations, you have been selected to compete in a series of African road rallies designed to test both the skill of the drivers and the ruggedness of the cars. You weren't sure you could handle a race like this, but your dad pooh-poohed that idea. Of course you can do it. I taught you everything I know. And he knows a lot. He and his brother were competition drivers racing for the Italian Ferrari and Lancia teams during the heyday of Le Mans and the Miglia and the Nuremberg races. This is a terrible book for a man like me who has never owned a car. I know nothing about driving or racing. As soon as you could see over the steering wheel of a Jeep, your father began teaching you about cars and driving. The hours you spent in Jeeps out on the range and in fast cars on the track your dad laid out behind the barn have paid off. You wish your dad were here with you, but he couldn't come. Some last-minute business forced him to cancel his plane reservations. At the competition headquarters, a large banner proclaiming the first African dual road race rally flaps slowly in a light breeze. People standing in clumps around a long table are talking excitedly. They are the drivers and navigators, the mechanics and the representatives of the companies sponsoring this race. You sign in at the competition desk. Welcome, here's your copy of the rules and regulations. I'm Michael Raploe, race chairman. He smiles at you, shakes your hand and gives you a large, bright blue folder that says race kit on the cover. You feel nervous. The other drivers look much older than you and seem very sure of themselves. This rally is special, Raploe continues. There are actually 2 races. One tests speed over fast roads in pre-prepared cars. In the other race, the rough road race, speed counts too, but you will be driving off-road vehicles. In each race you will choose your own course, driving from designated checkpoint to checkpoint until you finish. You will not be racing head-to-head with other cars in either race. Instead, you will select cars and be started at half-hour intervals to avoid head-to-head racing. The courses are too narrow and sometimes too crowded with animals and people for that. Do you understand? Yes, thanks, I understand, you tell him. You will be paired with a navigator co-driver chosen by lot, but that will come in a moment. Now you must choose which race you would like to start with. While you'll take part in both of them, you may decide which race you would like to drive first. I will go for the speed race first. The speed race is a difficult event. It's not like the Indianapolis 500. I don't know what that is. There isn't a track that you roar around lap after lap. You will start in Nairobi and travel through Kenya. You'll drive along fairly good roads, through game preserves, along flat surfaces in the highlands, and then through hilly stretches. Finally, you'll end up back in Nairobi. You'll be out on the roads at least 1 night during this race, and possibly 2 nights, depending on what happens. You eye some of your competitors. The German team is dressed in dark blue coveralls with their names in gold lettering over the breast pocket. They look very serious. The team from Zaire is dressed in tan jumpsuits. Though they are smiling, they look every bit as serious as the Germans. Now you are confronted with a choice of 2 cars for this half of the rally. You can choose between the race-prepared Saab 900 Turbo or a race-prepared Lancia Stratos. It's up to you. Is Lancia Eastern Bloc? No, I've just looked it up, and Lancia is an Italian make of car, which I'm sure everyone listening already knew and was just waiting for me to get on with it. I'll go with the Lancia, why not? You have chosen the Lancia Stratos. Maybe it will bring you a little luck. You remember your uncle's stories about racing Lancias in the Mille Miglia many years ago. You check the car out thoroughly. While the mechanics are reinforcing the battery hold-down and doing some other mechanical work you asked for, you discuss strategies with your navigator co-driver Jan. The Lancia's advantage is speed. We should make time while we can, Jan says. You feel that Jan is right. While you'd rather not push it at first, you'll want to get acquainted with the car. You decide to go along with Jan's suggestions. It turns out, however, that you really have no choice. You have to go all out. According to the schedule that you were given when you checked in, you were supposed to start at 3 p.m. The race officials have erred, though, and officially started their clocks at 2:30. The starters are adamant and refuse to restart you. We are officials. We are right, they say. You have lost 30 minutes because of the foul-up. Once started, though, you fly down the road trying to make up time. The Lancia really feels good to you, hugging the curves and stepping right out when you press down on the accelerator. Towards sunset, you flick on your lights. Suddenly you hear a crackling sound and smell burning insulation. Quickly you switch off the lights and pull off the road. Investigation under the hood shows extensive damage to the electrical system. What happened? You ask Jan, who has almost vanished into the engine compartment, ripping out burned wiring. I'm not sure, Jan says. It looks more like sabotage than anything else. Hand me those pliers, please. Jan makes the best repairs possible, but this car's lights give only a dim orange glow. They are not at full power. Now it is getting dark. You need to make up time, but driving at night without adequate light is dangerous. You could stop for a few hours until the moon comes up and use its light, but with the half hour you lost at the start and the time spent making repairs, that could be the end of your chance to win. If you go on, you won't be able to make great time, but at least you'll get further than you are now. Can you afford to wait? I don't think I can. I think nothing ventured, nothing gained. Driving at night without full headlights is hard. Your eyes are good though, and Jan helps concentrate on the dim shapes in front of you, giving warnings where necessary. The driving takes so much attention that you tire rapidly. You and Jan take turns at the wheel, and that helps a little. In the darkness, a fork in the road looms up. The right fork seems to continue through the valley. It's really hard to see, but the left fork seems to head through the hills up to the highlands. The hills will be hard to drive at night without full lights. Jan is asleep. A glance at the map confirms what the feeble lights point out. How much time have you made up so far? Which way should you go? The hills are harder to drive, but the map shows that route to be shorter. The valley road is longer, but it will be easier to drive once the moon comes up. The decision is yours. Jan must rest in order to be awake enough to take over. I think we'll stay in the valley. I've already pushed my luck once. I don't think I want to push it any further. You swing the wheel to the right and keep driving through the valley. The moon comes up, lighting up the road. As everything gets brighter, you increase your speed. Switching seats with Jan after an hour, you gaze at the moonlight on the grass and the umbrella trees out of the side windows before you close your tired eyes. Jan wakes you up from a dream about sleeping in a soft bed. Jan apologises for waking you and says you've only been asleep for about 20 minutes. We're lost, I think. Look at those mountains, they shouldn't be there. Jan's right. Those mountains shouldn't be there, if you are where you think you are. Maybe you missed a turn because you were too tired or you couldn't see well enough in the dark. Maybe you should have turned left after all. What now? Go back to look for the missed turn or keep going the way you've headed? I refuse to believe that I've made a mistake. Absolutely not. If I admit that in front of Jan, how will Jan ever respect me again? The only sensible thing to do is to completely double down and keep driving on. We've gone this far, you tell Jan, so let's keep going the way we're headed. 5 minutes later, you regret your words. The mountains loom even closer and look even stranger. You must be lost. Wait a minute, Jan shouts. Those aren't mountains, they're clouds. The moonlight just makes them look like mountains. The sun rising over the plains shows that Jan is right. You aren't lost after all. You press the accelerator down as the sun lights up the landscape. I knew it. I knew I was right. At about mid-morning, the flags of your next checkpoint appear. You stop to check in and gas up before you restart. You've made good time and are doing even better than you thought. There's not even any need to fix the lights. If everything goes well, you'll finish before nightfall. By pushing on through the night, you've more than made up the time you lost at the start. The Lancia performs perfectly on the last leg. Your driving is superb, and you pull in at the finish to the cheering of the crowd. Congratulations. So we now go to start the rough road race. While you're waiting in line at the race committee table to go through the paperwork for the rough road race, you notice the sign over the officials' heads. Be careful, watch out for animals, bad roads, snakes, and fatigue. This race will test your skill, stamina, and nerves. Although it isn't anywhere near as fast as the speed race, it is still full of hazards. Michael Raplow motions you over to the table. It's time to choose now. What will it be? You can drive a British Land Rover or a Japanese Toyota. The other cars are already spoken for. There's a picture of both cars. I don't know much about cars, but I do know what a Land Rover looks like, and it's a pretty decent stab at rendering a Land Rover. And Michael Raplow appears to be a man with a very impressive handlebar moustache. 80s really were good time for middle-aged men with moustaches, and he is no exception. So I'm going to choose a Land Rover because one of my dearest friends is obsessed with Land Rovers. She has a Land Rover that she loves to distraction, despite it basically being a black hole that you pour money into. You choose the British Land Rover. As you walk over to the garage to check its preparation and meet your co-driver, you glance at your wrist chronograph. It's a fancy name for a watch. Only 3 hours till you're scheduled to start. The paperwork with the officials took longer than you expected. You're hoping to get a navigator you can work well with. There are a lot of details to iron out before the start and not much time to do so. All you know about your navigator is the name on the stick you selected. Eduardo. At the garage, a long steel Quonset hut. A mechanic in a greasy overall points out your car. Your Rover, a red one with a white top, is jacked up in the air. One mechanic is busy with a grease gun under the car, another is waving a large wrench around and having an involved conversation with someone wearing a driver's suit. His back is to you. That must be your co-driver. It sure looks like the Eduardo you know, but can it be? He would have let you know he was going to be here. The mechanic with the wrench smiles and waves. The driver talking to him turns around. It is Eduardo. You and Eduardo have driven together before and worked well as a team. In addition, Eduardo has lots of experience on rough roads driving jeep tours in the Colorado Rockies. You and Eduardo hug each other heartily. And there's a picture of two good chums greeting each other warmly. You appear to be wearing driving gloves because I guess you could do that without irony in the 80s. What are you doing here? You ask him. Why didn't you let me know? I just got here this morning, Eduardo answers. I didn't know I'd be here myself. His voice becomes quieter. I'm substituting for someone who was killed in one of the races. Then his face brightens. Enough of that. We'll save the rest of the explanations for later. We've lots of work to do. How's the car? You ask Eduardo. In good shape. Hank and Bill are almost done. All the mechanical systems check out. Hank is finishing the chassis grease job and Bill and I are having a little argument about what weight motor oil to use. You listen to the argument for a few minutes, decide Bill is right and tell him to get on with it. Then you and Eduardo sit down with the maps and discuss routes, speed strategies and what supplies and spare equipment to take. We'll go on to the next bit. Before you know it, the starter has dropped the flag and you and Eduardo are off. You have decided to take a paved road out of Nairobi for 8 miles or so and then head off into the wilds. But you don't get more than 4 miles out of the city before you spot trouble ahead. A wooden barricade lies across the road and soldiers in khaki are standing stiffly at attention. You stop near the barricade and consult with the colonel there. He tells you in a stiff British accent that the route you want to take is blocked by thousands of drought refugees from the south. He says you might be able to continue along the way you've planned, but that an alternative route he traces on the map may be better. Against my better judgment, I'm going to go with the Colonel's route. The Colonel's argument for taking another route is persuasive. After some consultations with him over your map, you turn the Rover around and head back a short way down the road, looking for the dirt track the Colonel described to you. In the rearview mirror, you can see the Colonel waving goodbye. Not more than half a mile back, the Colonel had said. Turn left at the baobab tree. The track is not well marked, but you should be able to find it. The tree appears right on schedule. The road seems to be nothing more than 2 barely worn tracks in the grass, but the Colonel called it quite passable and said it led directly to the river crossing you were heading for. The road is even better than the Colonel promised. Before you know it, you are at the river crossing. I wish the Colonel had gone over our whole route with us, Eduardo says, turning around to look back at the road you've just driven. That road was great. Maybe that was great, but this isn't. Eduardo whips about to see what you are talking about. In the middle of the river you can see the ferry taking a passenger car across to the other side. It will be close to half an hour before you can get a ride across. What makes it worse, though, is the passenger on the ferry, which holds only one car, is a Blazer, the car driven by the team from Libya. The Blazer started before you did, and you are not racing head-to-head, but it is still infuriating to see your competition in front of you. Eduardo correctly points out that if you've come up on the Blazer, you're ahead in the race and you can afford to wait for the ferry. On the other hand, if you head down the riverbank, then strike off for the next crossing, you may gain even more time. Well, on that decision, I think I will call a pause to the race forever. I've been recording for a little over an hour now, and my throat is still not quite recovered, and I think I need to stop talking. So, I hope you found those at least somewhat diverting. I'm gonna go away, finish playing through them both, come back with some closing remarks, which I imagine will be fairly short. But I'll be back in just a few seconds. Tatty bye. I have finished both The Race Forever and Who Killed Harlowe Thrombey, and honestly, I enjoyed them both. Lots of fun. I'm going to, slightly controversially, deal with them in the reverse order to which I played them and talk a bit about The Race Forever first. I will say that the lack of a system crops up here. It does create some limitations. Unless you find an instant game over section, you'll always get to the end of the races, and each race exists independently of each other, so you don't get any sense that if you didn't do too well, you can make a really big comeback. I think maybe one big race might have been a better bet. The approach taken here kinda draws attention to the limitations of the format. You can make a terrible mess of one race, almost dying in fact, and then start the next race as if nothing has happened. And that's something all gamebooks have to deal with to an extent, but it highlights how even incredibly basic game systems can add depth to a gamebook. If this had a way of tracking your success, even in an incredibly simple way, it would add a lot and make the race feel more realistic. It feels very strange to just finish the second race and that's the end. There's no coda looking back over your experiences in both races, and that's just because there's no way of tracking how you've done in the race at all. I will say that the decisions in The Race Forever are really good. They're simple, but they make a lot of sense, and they feel like they have a real impact. There's lots of twists and unexpected events which are the hallmark of a choose-your-own-adventure book, but at the same time, I think in both of these books we're seeing a more developed and considered writing style. The Caves of Time, the first one, was very much a cavalcade of things happening with very little rhyme or reason to them. The Race Forever is determined to make everything feel like it belongs, and it's something I very much appreciate in a gamebook, a world that feels real and where events naturally fit into the backdrop that's been created. Obviously that's something that's a bit easier when you're playing with real locations, and The Race Forever is very specifically located in Kenya. Now, I'm the last person who should be commenting on representations of Africa, but from my incredibly sheltered and incredibly white perspective, I feel like the author is making a sincere effort not to be racist, while also delivering something that will feel African to the intended audience of white American children. There's obviously not more than a fairly superficial knowledge of Kenya and the surrounding area on display, but I think he's done a modicum of research. He may even have been to Kenya. And I think he is trying to avoid some of the more colonialist tropes of Western adventure fiction. You can meet bandits and a mysterious warrior who can heal some injuries with ancient medicine unknown in the West. You can also meet some famine victims in search of food and support. It's very definitely an outsider's perspective on Kenya in 1983, hitting the sort of notes that you might expect to see in the news. And there's elements of that are problematic, but it doesn't read as someone writing with malice. But of course, I'm as white as you can get, and my reading of it doesn't count for a great deal. I will say that I found many of the encounters very exciting and evocative. It's enjoyable to read a book that's squarely based on the real world, modelling things that people actually do, such as long-distance off-road racing. As someone who has neither a driving licence nor a passport, this is very much the closest I'm going to get to the experience of racing across Kenya, or indeed being in Kenya at all, and I very much appreciated it. It's a reminder that the real world is full of amazing things that very few people actually get to do, and giving the reader a fictional taste of that is very cool. Structurally, this is very simple. Refreshingly simple, in fact. It's actually quite nice to have a book which isn't tying itself in knots over the structure. You've got a 2-act structure with the 2 races, assuming you make it as far as the second race, which is by no means certain. You can do them in any order, which is nice. Then within that, you've got a fairly pure branching narrative with the big choices leading to completely different stories, with no scope for crossing back to the other narrative strands. When you choose a different car, you're choosing a completely different adventure with its own twists and turns. And it's something that modern design has tended to be wary of. If you look at books like Destiny Quest or Legendary Kingdoms, there's a real effort there to make it possible to visit almost everywhere, and in some sense do almost everything. These more branching narratives feel old-fashioned, but at the same time that makes them feel paradoxically quite fresh, because I think gamebook design has moved so far away from that. Basically, The Race Forever is just a lot of fun. It's an old-fashioned adventure story with a very specific setting that it mines well for excitement and unusual events. Who Killed Harlowe Thrombey, by contrast, is more experimental in its structure than The Race Forever, whereas The Race Forever is fundamentally built around the familiar premise of the book having many different possible endings. That is, after all, the big draw of Choose Your Own Adventure books. Harlowe Thrombey is doing its best to give you the feeling of investigating an old-fashioned murder mystery, and quite honestly, it does a bang-up job for the most part. You've got a diabolical crime and a laundry list of suspects, and the book unfolds with you basically talking to suspects, and the frustratingly competent Jenny Mudge, and the pleasantly Watsonian Inspector Prufrock, who would have genuinely struggled to solve Cain murdering Abel. Gradually, your list of suspects shrinks as you find out more information until you're in a position to unmask the actual murderer. It's just a very nicely realised little book, and I enjoyed it a great deal. I think there's probably scope to build on the foundations of this to create a really complex and interesting whodunit gamebook. And more than The Race Forever, which I think doesn't really hint at much in the way of interesting design, it's a good example of classic Choose Your Own Adventure design, Harlowe Thrombey hints at ways you could develop something similar to create a modern, in-depth whodunit mystery book. And that's really interesting. It doesn't overload you with clues and information. It's clear from the outset that the author has worked out exactly what has happened and what clues and red herrings to throw into the mix before putting pen to paper on the text. And while it's scarcely a complex puzzle, the fact that you can look at it from a bunch of different angles and the information still stacks up makes it feel very nicely and competently designed. I also like seeing a character-focused gamebook, and these are very hard to do well. Humans naturally attend well to information about other humans. It's the one thing that most of us, the neurotypical ones at least, are an expert on, and so that makes it easier to spot errors and things that don't feel quite real. It's hard enough writing convincing characters in a film or a novel, never mind characters who you might meet at different points having done different things, so it's great to see that as a challenge being fully taken on in this book. I think the relative brevity of a Choose Your Own Adventure book probably helps here. There's just not as much space to create paradoxes or have people behave weirdly out of character. There's still scope for different endings to Harlowe Thrombey, but it's noticeable that there's many less endings than in The Race Forever. I think it's much more about the journey, and this decision contributes to the book feeling more like a conventional story than a gamebook in some ways. Unlike the traditional approach where you can end up in all sorts of different pickles, this plays out in a more linear fashion. That's not a criticism. I think that's the best approach to take with this kind of material. The whodunit usually has a fairly rigid structure, and everything you do to mess with that structure will take away from the feeling that you're actually involved in a whodunit. There's a few blind alleys and different outcomes you can get to, including one particularly humiliating one where Prufrock solves the crime, which is a bit like being outwitted by a cat. I also like that there's a completely different tack you can take involving a professional criminal who isn't even directly involved in the action. It feels left field, but still fits within the overall sleuthing vibe, although it does drag in just a very subtle, hard-boiled detective vibe. It doesn't always hang perfectly together. One of the better endings only really makes sense if you took Thrombey up on his dinner invitation, because it sort of assumes you were present when certain things happened, and although you can become aware that those things happened, it doesn't gel together anything like as well as it does if you are actually in the room for the murder. My biggest criticism is that most of the different endings involve you finding the right solution to the case one way or another. Unless you screw up very badly, those responsible for the murder are going to get brought to justice, and that feels like giving the big reveal away very cheaply. The big reveal is the crowning moment of any whodunit, and it feels to me like you ought to have to work a little bit harder to get to the right answer. I suspect there may have been a desire to avoid depicting criminals getting away with their crimes. Historically, in the US, the Hays Code, which regulated cinema between 1934 and 1968, and the Comics Code Authority, which regulated comic books from 1954, had a real downer on the notion of criminals going unpunished. Even though neither of these codes applied to children's books, you can see how writers in the early 1980s would have grown up with these rules very much in the background and acting as an influence on how they approached fiction. Although there's never been a national instrument like the Hays Code or the Comics Code Authority for children's literature, state and more local bans and the negative publicity that those bans attract was a risk in 1983, although ironically less so than it is in 2024, where book banning seems to have evolved into a local sport for school boards in particular. Consciously or unconsciously, I think there's an evident desire to nail the baddies in this book, which makes the couple of endings where it's not clear that that happens all the more precious. It almost became a secondary game for me in reading the book, trying to screw up so badly that the baddies have a chance to get away. That probably doesn't say anything good about me as a person, but it adds a layer of meta-enjoyment to things. I think both of these books are tremendous fun and show a development from the earliest choose-your-own-adventure books towards trying to produce something that delivers on a very specific fantasy. And this is the thing that makes the series distinct in my mind, the sheer breadth of inspiration that's been drawn on. I'm grateful to Stuart Lloyd yet again for sending me copies of the books I've covered today. There's still a big stack of choose-your-own-adventure books to get through, so I imagine we'll dip in again at some point when I'm under the weather. They're really good comfort reading, that's for sure. I think I enjoyed Harlowe Thrombey more, but then I'm a fan of murder mysteries, so it was always going to be right up my alley. With The Race Forever, I was taken by what seemed like a good faith effort towards internationalism, as well as providing an experience that did make me think I might actually quite enjoy driving across the Kenyan countryside. I'm never going to do it, my life has just worked out very differently to that, but it does suggest I might potentially actually enjoy it. I think A Race is a good backdrop for a game book, and although it was bringing in a fair number of action story cliches, it also felt a lot more grounded than some game books. While it might not be plausible, it did at least all feel theoretically possible, and I enjoyed some of the challenges, being electrical faults and arguing with my co-driver. I also think that R.A. Montgomery has a slightly better prose style than Edward Packard. They're both writing in a fairly basic idiom, but I think Montgomery does a better job of painting pictures with his words and getting a little more emotional depth into his descriptions. Packard's style is often functional to the point of minimalism, which doesn't always create a strong connection with the action. Perfectly pleasant to read, but based on this very small and maybe not particularly representative sample, I think Montgomery has a narrow edge, and it's something I'll look at again when and if we do more choose-your-own-adventure books. Well, that is all for this episode. I'll be back pretty soon, actually, with December's main episode in which I'll be playing Deathmore, book 55 in the Fighting Fantasy series. I hope you'll join me for that. In the meantime, you can email me at hjdoomretrofun, all one word, at gmail.com, or you can follow me on Blue Sky. Thank you very much for listening, take care, and I'll see you soon.